The close US-Turkish relationship dates back to the early days of the Cold War. That's when Turkey sent its troops to fight alongside US soldiers in the Korean War. In return, Turkey became an important NATO member and a bulwark against Soviet expansionism in the Eastern Mediterranean. As of 2018, Turkey's armed forces are the fourth most powerful in the alliance, and the Incirlik airbase in southern Turkey serves as a critical hub for US fighter jets in their Middle East missions, particularly over Iraq and Syria. But despite the current cooperation between the US and Turkey, the strategic alliance and trust between the countries began to falter with the end of the Cold War. I'm Kasim, this is KJ Vids, and in this video we will look at the US-Turkish relationship. During the Cold War, US military power provided Turkey a shield against the Soviet Union. US President Harry Truman's deployment of the battleship Missouri to Istanbul in 1946 came at a time of high tension between Ankara and Moscow and is widely seen as the symbolic beginning of a strategic partnership. The US helped to construct Incirlik in 1955, which served as a key airbase in the region during the Cold War and after, particularly during the First Gulf War in 1991, during a time when Turkey depended heavily on US aid. But conflicting interests began to strain the relationship. This first began in the aftermath of the First Gulf War, when the US created a protectorate for the Kurds in northern Iraq in 1991. Turkey believes that this US move encouraged Kurdish separatism within Turkey. The Kurds are Turkey's largest minority and have long had tensions with the state over rights, which erupted in a war in southeast Turkey in the 1980s. Ankara fears that the Kurds will form an autonomous region along the Turkish border and catalyze Turkey's Kurds to break away territory from Turkey. Later in 2003, the Turkish parliament voted against providing a northern corridor for 60,000 US ground troops to roll into Iraq in case of war with that country. Relations improved temporarily when Barack Obama took office in 2008. The former US president landed in Ankara on his second international trip in April 2009, making Turkey his first destination in the Middle East. He described US-Turkish relations as a model partnership and praised Erdogan. But that relationship deteriorated as the Syrian civil war on Turkey's border and the associated refugee crisis worsened. In addition to this, Ankara's quest for the extradition of the Muslim cleric Fethullah Gulen, who Erdogan blamed for the failed coup in 2016, and Washington's concerns about US citizens and embassy staff detained in Turkey further weakened the trust. Ankara's primary goal in Syria has been preventing the YPG from creating an autonomous Kurdish region along the Turkish border, which it fears could lead to an independence bid or be used to stage attacks on Turkey. Though Turkey has long opposed the United States' support for the Syrian Democratic Forces, a large portion of which consists of the YPG, the issue really came to a head early this year after Turkey invaded Afrin, a Kurdish-controlled area in northwest Syria. In January 2018, Turkish military drove Russian-backed YPG fighters from the Afrin region of northwestern Syria. Ankara's threats to expand this operation 60 miles east to Manbij, where US-backed YPG fighters and US Special Forces were based, raised the worrying prospect of Turkish and American soldiers pointing guns at one another. But to avoid a direct conflict with a US-backed force, Turkey refrained from moving into Manbij. After months of negotiations, the US and Turkey reached a deal in early June. YPG military forces would withdraw from certain areas around Manbij, and the US and Turkey would conduct independent but coordinated patrols around the perimeter of Manbij city. Over the past several weeks, Turkish pro-government newspaper Daily Sabah has published reports indicating that US and Turkish forces are cooperating in Manbij, a sign that even if Turkey isn't entirely satisfied with the current arrangement, it's pleased that the US is willing to come to some compromise on the issue. Since Russia intervened in the Syrian conflict, Turkey has also gradually accepted Russia as the key player in the region. The growing relations between Turkey and Russia have been bearing fruit for a while. The benefits to Turkey are most visible in the energy sector, including the construction of the Turkish Stream natural gas pipeline across the Black Sea from Russia to Turkey, and the construction of the $20 billion Akiyu nuclear power plant on the Mediterranean. In December 2017, Turkey signed a $2.5 billion agreement to purchase a Russian S-400 missile defense system, more than half of which will be financed by Russia. Its NATO allies said they are concerned that the S-400 is incompatible with NATO systems, but in reality they fear that the S-400 may be used against NATO members, particularly Greece, with which Turkey has an ongoing dispute over Cyprus. The US fears that Turkey's use of both Russian and American defense systems could give Russia insight into how the F-35 works and reveal weaknesses in the stealth capabilities which Russia could then exploit. So the US moved to deny Turkey access to the fighter, but this may be temporary as Turkey is also in talks with America to allow the transfer of the Patriot missile technology, which would give Turkey both an air defense system and the F-35. Turkey may therefore only be using the Russian S-400 deal as leverage, but this remains to be seen. Tensions recently escalated further over the 2016 detention in Turkey of American pastor Andrew Craig Brunson. He is accused of spying for the Kurdistan Workers' Party and the US-based cleric Fethullah Gulen, who was once an ally of the Turkish president and is now accused of orchestrating the failed 2016 coup. The US has insisted on Brunson's release and announced that it would impose sanctions on 2 Turkish government officials over Brunson's continued detention. Turkey has demanded that the sanctions be lifted and promised to respond. US-Turkish relations were summarized by international relations expert Soli Özel of Istanbul's Kadir University. He said that there is a structural problem in Turkish-American relations that dates back all the way to the end of the Cold War. That is, the interests have diverged, and the two countries have never really been able to figure out what the common base upon which they would build their relations again would be, and those issues have never been resolved, quite frankly. Turkey and the US clearly have many issues pushing them apart, but they also have some common interests drawing them together. According to some analysts, the most important relates to Russia. Despite Turkey's cooperation with Russia in the Syrian war, which became increasingly necessary as Turkey became more involved there and needed to avoid clashing with the Syrian government troops backed by Russia, Ankara nevertheless remains wary of Moscow. The two have fought countless wars since the 18th century. Turkey was a key part of the containment line against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and they nearly came into direct military conflict during the Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the early 1990s. Historical competition between Russia and Turkey was driven by 2 factors. The first was Russia's desire to seize control of the Bosphorus from the Ottomans so that it could have guaranteed access to the Mediterranean. The second was Russia's desire to drive out the Ottomans and Iranians into the South Caucasus. Ultimately, Russia wants to keep Turkey as well as Iran from establishing a strong presence in the South Caucasus, since any state with a foothold there can threaten Russian territory in the North Caucasus. Turkey has historical links to the Caucasus, particularly in Azerbaijan, whose population is dominated by a Turkic ethnic group. Turkey's purchase of Russian weapon systems won't change these realities, which have made them adversaries for centuries. On the other hand, Washington needs Ankara as a non-Arab partner in the Middle East that can counterbalance Iran, which has supported the Assad regime in Syria, backs the Houthis in Yemen, and has Hezbollah as its proxy in Lebanon. But limiting Russia's reach is still the main reason they need each other. It's also important to note that the AKP's political interests are served by rhetorical attacks on the United States, geopolitical hedging with Russia and other non-Western powers, and an aggressively anti-Kurdish security policy both at home and in Syria. This structural dynamic is unlikely to change in the short to mid-term. It is likely that the political rhetoric between the United States and Turkey will remain fractured, but given Turkey's geostrategic location in the backyard of Russia and bordering Iraq, Iran and Syria, the United States has an interest in maintaining the relationship. Turkey meanwhile does not need to add to its economic woes, so despite the shifts, the United States and Turkey still need each other. All in all, the key indicator of the strength of US-Turkish relations is the balance of power between Turkey and Russia. If Turkey grows stronger relative to Russia, Ankara's need for US support will diminish. Thanks for watching another KJ video. We appreciate your support. Please kindly leave your opinions and views in the comments below, and we will see to answer your questions as best we can. You can also support us by becoming a Patreon from as little as $1 per month. Your support will help us to pay for content, licenses, footage, and conduct original research. But if you don't want to do that, please continue to like and share our content. Thank you.